All right, we're just going to start off with a bang here. 20 years from now, Bitcoin, where are we? And not in terms of price, but can we get to a global reserve currency? Can we get to it being used kind of coexistence with the U.S. dollar? What do you think is possible here?
Sure. So I think that right now Bitcoin is a global settlement layer. We're already
Okay.
seeing that Bitcoin settles, right now between $1 and $2 billion a day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Notional, which is in U.S. dollars, which is substantial amount of money. I think that over the next 20 years, that number is only going to continue to go up. I think over the next 20 years, we will have figured out, ways to make Bitcoin viable for small scale payments as well, which won't be, which I don't believe are going to be on chain. I think in terms of its existence in the global financial system, I see over the next 20 years, I think it's entirely possible that central banks will hold Bitcoin reserves. I don't know that it can achieve any sort of reserve status currency over the next 20 years, even in our wildest dreams. But I think it's entirely possible that it plays a significant role, especially as smaller developing currencies start to collapse. I think what people often forget is that the median lifespan of most nation state issued currencies isn't that long, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sort of even we look at the U.S. dollar as having longevity and the U.S. government being the sort of lender of last resort. But and the U.S. government, in the grand scheme of things, has existed and dollars have been in circulation for a substantial amount of time. But I think that, especially with much smaller currencies, we're seeing what happens with poor monetary policy. We're seeing it in Iran and Venezuela and Turkey now. And I saw that. I think you put out the tweet earlier this week that Roger Ver stole. But we're seeing the collapse of currencies all over the world. I think that there's a further conversation to be had about whether Bitcoin does become a global reserve asset itself, where and this process is what a lot of the Bitcoin maximalists, of a group where I would consider myself firmly in, consider sort of hyper Bitcoinization, right? So post hyper Bitcoinization, Bitcoin is stable enough to be a viable means of exchange and unit of account all over the world. But I think well before that, there could exist sort of in a free banking type model, nation state issued currencies that are just pegged to Bitcoin. Similar to how we had the gold standard, and before that in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we had all sorts of bimetallic pegs, all of which collapsed for a host of reasons. But I think that the first step in that process will be actually returning to a Bitcoin reserve, and this is something that Saifedean has covered in detail in the Bitcoin Standard, and I think sort of before that we'll start to see substantial growth even from the volumes it's doing today in Bitcoin's utility as a global settlement layer, where it's already settling numbers that annually are comparable to gold markets.
Absolutely. And so, as this global settlement layer becomes more prevalent, do you think that these smaller currencies and smaller markets actually gravitate towards it in the short term? Or do you think it's something where they'll continue to kind of flounder and really suffer until some other event makes this overly attractive to them? Right? Because
Sure.
if you look at Turkey, for example, right now, there's some flight to Bitcoin, but it's not kind of half the economy,
Sure.
right? And so how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that there's two ways of thinking about it. One is over a very, very long-term view. And the reality is that in that very long-term view, so long as it survives another day, Bitcoin's almost like a black hole, right? It's a black hole sucking in all assets that are weaker forms of money. I think that over a very, very long time horizon, it's entirely possible that this could include the U.S. dollar. On shorter time frames, I think it's most relevant to even see what's happening in Venezuela, for example, where citizens are swapping bolivars for primarily dollars, but also Bitcoin. because even dollars, despite the fact that there's a substantial number of dollars that are printed every year, are still a significantly harder form of money than bolivars. And I think that what will happen over time is, that people will always have the sort of inclination to, use their weak forms of money and to acquire and hoard stronger forms of money, especially if they don't have widespread access to it, like they do Bitcoin. And so, in the short term, I think that we'll start to see, the shift in economies where they absolutely have to, where they have no other choice. So, in Venezuela, even if you had bought Bitcoin at the highest possible local rate at the peak of the market in December, your purchasing power in, relative to bolivars would still be twice, what it would be if you had held bolivars, despite the fact that Bitcoin has dropped by a factor of 3. And so I think that in the short term, we'll start to see shifts where people have no other choice, especially in countries that have significant capital controls, where they're still able to bring in Bitcoin. And in the long term, we'll see. We'll have to. I think that it's inevitable that we'll see a convergence effect there.